Hi AP Bio, today's lecture is going to be on Chapter 30, Plant Reproduction in Angiosperms. So the plant kingdom consists of mosses and liverworts, ferns, gymnosperms, also known as conifers, and angiosperms, which are flowering plants. And so mosses, liverworts, and ferns, these are actually spore-bearing plants, and they reproduce asexually. But gymnosperms and angiosperms, as you can see in this picture, they produce seeds. So they reproduce by sexual reproduction. There's actually sperm and eggs that combine together, and their little babies are enclosed within seeds. Now, most of the plants that we see on Earth today, about 90% of them are actually angiosperms. They're flowering plants. And you also, in Colorado, see a lot of conifers, or what we call evergreen trees, and those are part of a group of plants called gymnosperms. So they have cones, and their seeds are contained in these ovules, but they don't produce flowers or fruits. So today we're going to focus on angiosperms. And the three unique features of angiosperms is they have flowers, they produce fruits, and their embryos, or the little baby plants, are enclosed in a protective seed. This is the life cycle of angiosperms. Angiosperms alternate between a diploid state. So in looking at this diagram, you have to start down at the bottom where you see the seed, and it starts to grow, and as a germinating seed, you'll see the roots and the shoots come out. And this big plant is the mature sporophyte plant. It is diploid, or 2N. Now, these angiosperms can grow these reproductive structures that we know as flowers, and within the flowers, they contain both male and female sex cells. So the sperm are contained in this area called the anther, and they're released in the form of pollen. And within the ovule right here are the eggs. So once the pollen fertilizes the eggs, with the sperm and eggs combined, they form this diploid zygote. So the sperm and eggs are haploid, remember? And as the zygote develops, it grows into the embryo, or the baby plant. And it is enclosed within a seed, which is a feature of angiosperms. So the four main parts of a flower include stamens, which has the anther section here, and the filament, which is the stalk that keeps the anther upright. And this is where pollen is produced. And then the carpel, or pistil, right here is this green structure, and it contains a stigma, which is sticky, and so when pollen grains land on there, they stick there. And then the sperm cells leave the pollen and create a pollen tube and go down into the ovule where the egg cells are located. So this is, if you want to think about it, the female reproductive part of the flower. This is the male part. We also have petals, these brightly colored structures right here. They are to attract pollinators. And the sepal are these tiny little green leaves, and they are the leaves that enclose the flower bud for protection before the flower actually blooms. So this is an example of a flower where you can see this is the anther and the filament. So these are the male reproductive organs. And you can see a sprinkling of the pollen here on the petals. Within the middle, as you can see my pointer right there, there is the stigma, and it's going to be held up by the style. And so this is the place where pollen grains will land. And of course, we can see the petals. We don't see the sepals in this picture. So one common flower you're going to see out there is dandelions, and you can see the structure of the dandelion here. It does include petals and sepals and both male and female reproductive parts. And once the dandelion flowers are pollinated, it produces individual seeds. So you see these little flyaway guys that are going to be really common out there once the snow melts the grass. So the pollination is when pollen is transferred from the anther to the stigma. And it can be done through a variety of ways, including from mammals, small mammals that go in for the nectar or some kind of food source that the flowers provide. And in the meantime, some of the pollen rubs off on its little nose or its little feet, and it spreads it from flower to flower. Same things with other animal pollinators such as bees and bats and hummingbirds. So all of these are animal pollinators that the plant provides some kind of benefit for these animals to come, and then as they come, they'll get some pollen rubbed off on them and they'll be transferred from flower to flower. Pollen can also be transmitted through wind and through the air by insects. A lot of plants, the reason they have pretty colorful flowers is because while these insects might not be able to see in color, they're able to distinguish different shades that are attractive to them, and so they know exactly where to land, such as in the middle of this flower. And so that's kind of like sort of a landing pad visual display that flowers offer. Now, some plants are self-pollinated, but this is not ideal because it doesn't allow for genetic variation. And so for plants to survive in different conditions, it's really beneficial to have cross-pollination where different plants are pollinating. And so some plants avoid self-pollination by having self-incompatibility, where they will reject their own pollen or pollen from a closely related plant, and that's to maximize genetic variation. So a couple of ways that flowers might have to reduce self-pollination is if you're wind-pollinated, you may have your stamens sticking up so the pollen gets out of the flower easily and then must be carried by the wind or some kind of animal that visits. So it's not so easy for that pollen to actually fall into where the styles are. And then the styles, this is where they're sticking up, so you're going to have some kind of insect or thing that burrows down into the flower to be able to get the pollen from here. And so you don't have pollen just kind of falling down and landing on the sticky stigma right here. And so this pin flower avoids self-pollination. So once the pollen releases the sperm cells, and the sperm cells create a pollen tube, will travel down the stigma and reach the ovule, which contains the egg. And so there the sperm and the egg combine, so those are haploid cells, and they form a diploid zygote. These cells start to divide by mitosis, as usual, and forms an embryonic plant. And so you can see this embryo right here has the beginnings of the roots, and these are the shoots. So the stems and leaves are going to grow from there. And the other notably anatomy or part of an angiosperm is that these embryos are protected within a tough seed coat, and there's also this material around the embryo called the endosperm, and it actually contains carbohydrates and food for this embryo before it really germinates and develops roots and shoots and starts to produce food through photosynthesis. It can break down this stored food from the endosperm to be able to feed itself as it's developing. So a notable feature about angiosperms is these seeds are enclosed in a fruit, and once the egg cell is fertilized, it becomes the plant embryo, and the ovules that the egg cells are in inside the ovary become the seeds, and the ripe ovary actually starts to develop and grow into the fruit. Remember, as our last lecture, we talked about how some sugar sinks are places where you want to store sugar or send sugar, and fruit is definitely a place you want to send sugar to. So this fruit protects the enclosed seed, but also aids in the dispersal of these seeds away from that parent plant by a variety of means, including water, wind, or animals. So these are a variety of different types of fruits that you see here. So here's a pea pod, and each of these little peas is actually a seed. Many of you guys might enjoy eating raspberries, and you can see each one of these little round bulbs is actually a fruitlet with a little seed inside each one. Pineapple fruits are a type of fruit called multiple fruits, so each one of those sections actually has seeds inside them and grows into separate pineapple plants. And this is your apple. Now normally we draw apples actually upside down, but if you notice in this picture it looks upside down to you, but it's actually right side up. This bottom part where you usually see like some dried leaf like things, these are the remnants of the sepals and remains of the stamens and styles. And this stalk right here is the attachment to the tree, and within it you have the little apple seeds. And so this fleshy part is definitely an attractant for the animal dispersers who eat the fruit and then take the carcass of the fruit, so to speak, away from the parent plant so that these little babies grow away from the parent, because underneath that parent apple tree is a lot of shade and these babies need a new place to grow. So these seeds, generally, they have a pretty tough outer coating, and once these seeds are produced, they usually go into a period of dormancy. It is where the seed is resting. So now keep in mind, we don't say that the seed is dead, they are merely dormant. And so the cells that are within these seeds experience a low metabolic rate. Their growth and development is suspended, and they resume their growth when the environmental conditions are good for germination. So these seeds can be dispersed through a variety of means: by wind, with animals, by water, like the coconut here. You can see the shoots coming up right there. Some of these seeds actually dry out and then they burst open and the seeds just kind of spread everywhere by themselves. And then humans are also good seed dispersers as well. So just showing you a few pictures. In my yard right now, there's a lot of dandelions, and also in Colorado, probably see a lot of tumbleweeds. Now, some of the seeds actually have thorns on them, or are kind of sticky like that, and if animals are walking through a field, some of these sticky thorns actually stick to the fur coat of these animals and help to disperse the seeds. You got seeds that get moved around by ants, and black bears, when they eat these berries, they poop them out, and actually allows the spreading of a lot of seeds, and so that's how a lot of plants get spread wherever bears live, which is great. Now, these seeds land, and what happens to them? Well, they are dormant for a period of time. Usually that's over the winter time, and these seeds could be dormant for years. There are some seeds to have known to have been dormant for thousands of years, and when found later through excavating archaeological dig sites, scientists have actually been able to get some of those really ancient seeds to germinate, so they can be dormant for a really long time. And the conditions that are right for these seeds to be able to germinate is when there's a lot of water. So these seeds soak up the water. This is called imbibition, and it triggers enzymatic processes to occur and metabolic changes occur within the cell. So as the seed germinates, you're going to have the little root end coming out, and then the shoots start to grow. Now notice that this seed has two seed leaves called cotyledons, this particular one, and then the first true leaves, the foliage leaves, start to grow. Now the reason for these leaves needing to break up through the ground is so that it can seek light and be able to do photosynthesis through these leaves, and so that it can produce its own food source, because plants still need to be able to break down glucose to produce ATP through cellular respiration, and until these shoots grow out, it won't have food, so that's why these seeds contain the endosperm, which is the stored food for the little embryo. So as seeds start to germinate, this is a really vulnerable time for plants, because through wind, bad weather, animals stomping around, bad conditions, it's really hazardous for plants. So these plants produce a lot of seeds, but not many of the babies actually survive. And so there's also parasites and predators that could be eating, or herbivores that are eating these plants. So the plants that we just talked about that are flowering plants are going to reproduce pretty much sexually, and the flower is the reproductive sexual organ. Seeds are formed. It allows these plants to reproduce with a lot of genetic diversity in the cross-pollination that happens. But it's complex and hazardous for these seedlings. And so this is an advantage for plants that live in really unstable environments, that you have a lot of genetic variability and be able to spread a lot of seeds everywhere. Now, some plants also reproduce asexually, and so this is called vegetative reproduction. All the offspring are going to be clones, genetically identical to the parents. It's a lot simpler. There's no need for pollinators, and this type of reproduction is more suitable for stable environments. So a variety of ways that humans have cultivated plants through asexual reproduction is that they can create cuttings from plants, and so they might cut off the top stem, put them into some water like this, and let the roots grow. And then once the roots grow, you can actually plant this plant in another place. So this little cutting is genetically identical to the parent that it came from. This is the same thing with potatoes. Each of these potatoes have these little places we call eyes. And if you actually cut the potato into different chunks, where each chunk has an eye there, those little chunks can grow into separate potato plants. You also have some plants like strawberries that reproduce with sending out runners. So one strawberry plant will be anchored into the ground. It'll grow these little stems that are offshoots and grow a new little baby strawberry plant. So often a whole strawberry patch is actually just made up of a bunch of different runners. And then bulbs can also split. So like garlic bulbs we've talked about before, each of the little cloves you can separate out and plant them, and they can grow asexually. In Colorado, we have a lot of aspen trees, and we know that aspens have roots systems that are really extensive. So you might have a whole grove of trees that actually, when you take a genetic sample of them, these are all identical. So they reproduce vegetatively through the roots underground, growing whole new trees. So some people think that the largest organism on Earth are a group of trees that reproduce asexually altogether. Now, within the biotech labs, you can also have some cloning that occurs because in carrot cells, there's a lot of different regions within a carrot plant that contain the stem cells or meristematic tissue. You can actually grow them in media like this, providing the nutrients for the plant to be able to propagate and grow a whole new plant. Okay, so today, that was it for our reproduction with plants.